On a warm spring evening in 1998, the vibrant life of Shannon Schieber, a promising graduate student at the prestigious Wharton School, was extinguished in a chilling act of violence. Found strangled in her Philadelphia apartment, her tragic death would set off a chain of revelations that exposed systemic failures, spanned thousands of miles, and led to a desperate race against time to stop a predator. What unfolded was a tale of determined detective work, cutting-edge forensic science, and the harrowing consequences of overlooked warnings.
A neighborhood mourns the death of a brilliant young student.
Tonight, News 10 has new information in the Shannon Schieber case.
On the night of May 7, 1998, Shannon Schieber's Philadelphia apartment sat quiet, perched on the second floor of a bustling neighborhood. Shannon, a 23-year-old graduate student at the prestigious Wharton School of Business, was known for her brilliance, warmth, and ambition. She had recently celebrated a major academic milestone, her future gleaming with promise. But as the city hummed with the sounds of evening life, something far darker unfolded behind her apartment walls. When neighbors heard muffled screams through the night, some assumed it was a couple fighting. No one called the police. Hours later, a friend, concerned when Shannon missed a scheduled meeting, alerted authorities. What they discovered inside her apartment was devastating. Shannon's lifeless body lay on the floor, bearing the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. She had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and her killer had stolen personal belongings before vanishing without a trace. The scene offered few immediate clues. The killer had entered through a balcony, leaving almost no sign of his presence. For her family, friends, and the city, the tragedy was incomprehensible. How could such a horrific act occur in a place that felt safe? As the news spread, it cast a pall over the community, igniting both fear and outrage. Shannon's name quickly became a rallying cry for justice, but for detectives, it marked the start of a long, grueling search for a shadowy predator who seemed to have disappeared into the night. In the days following Shannon Schieber's murder, the Philadelphia Police Department launched an intensive investigation. Detectives scoured her apartment for evidence, interviewed neighbors, and pieced together a timeline of her final hours. But as days turned into weeks, their progress was maddeningly slow. The killer had been careful, leaving few traces behind. The balcony entry offered little usable evidence, and without eyewitnesses or immediate leads, the case began to stall. The community was left reeling. Students at the University of Pennsylvania, where Shannon was pursuing her MBA, were gripped with fear. Young women living alone started double-checking their locks, avoiding going out at night and looking over their shoulders. Candlelight vigils were held in Shannon's memory as her grieving family called for justice. Yet the police had little to offer in return. Months dragged on with no breakthroughs. Despite the dedication of the investigators, the case grew colder by the day. It was a cruel irony for a city struggling with a rise in violent crime. A Wharton student, a beacon of hope and success, had been brutally murdered just blocks from one of the nation's most prestigious universities. Public trust in the investigation wavered, with whispers of frustration growing louder in the absence of answers. Behind the scenes, detectives faced mounting pressure. Without fresh evidence or witnesses willing to come forward, every lead seemed to hit a wall. The murder of Shannon Schieber appeared destined to become another unsolved case, a haunting reminder of a predator still at large, lurking somewhere in the city. 8 months after Shannon Schieber's murder, the investigation seemed frozen in time. Then, an anonymous tip shattered the silence, exposing a truth more damning than the lack of progress. The Philadelphia Police Department had knowingly concealed a series of earlier sexual assaults to manipulate crime statistics. These cases, unreported to the public, shared disturbing similarities with Shannon's murder. The cover-up painted a grim picture. Over several years, young women living alone in Philadelphia had been attacked in their homes, often in areas not far from Shannon's apartment. The predator had a chilling method, gaining entry through windows or balconies, attacking under the cover of darkness. In each case, the victims were left traumatized, but alive. Shannon's murder was his first known escalation to homicide. One of the previously suppressed cases had produced a police sketch of a suspect, but it had been buried alongside the unacknowledged reports. Now unearthed, the sketch reignited hope in the investigation, but it also sparked public outrage. Families, women's rights advocates, and community leaders demanded accountability. Why had the police chosen to downplay such a clear pattern of danger? How many more women might have been spared if earlier attacks had been taken seriously? For Shannon's family, this revelation was a bitter pill to swallow. It wasn't just a case of a dangerous predator evading capture, it was systemic negligence, a betrayal of trust. Yet, even with the new leads, detectives faced an uphill battle. The pattern was clear, but the identity of the attacker remained a mystery. The investigation would need to dig deeper, and this time, there was no room for mistakes. With the revelations about the earlier attacks, investigators realized they were dealing with more than an isolated crime. This was the work of a serial predator. But who was he, and why had he escalated to murder with Shannon Schieber? To answer these questions, police turned to cutting-edge investigative tools of the time: geographic profiling and criminal profiling. Geographic profiling, a method that maps crime locations to predict an offender's base of operations, became a critical focus. The earlier attacks and Shannon's murder were clustered in specific neighborhoods of Philadelphia, suggesting the perpetrator was deeply familiar with the area. Investigators theorized he might live or work nearby, blending into the community while carrying out his attacks in secret. At the same time, the FBI was brought in to create a psychological profile of the killer. Behavioral experts painted a chilling picture. The suspect was likely a voyeur who meticulously stalked his victims before attacking, choosing targets who lived alone and whose routines he could study. His ability to climb balconies and enter undetected hinted at someone physically fit and deliberate in his actions. They also warned that his escalation to murder likely stemmed from a victim fighting back, a possibility that haunted investigators. But even with these tools, the case refused to break. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, revisited cold leads, and expanded their search radius. Despite the high-tech strategies, they were chasing shadows. The frustration was palpable, but the profiles offered a roadmap, keeping the team focused and determined. They were now certain of one thing: this predator was highly adaptable, and unless he was caught, he would strike again. For nearly a year after Shannon Schieber's murder, the predator who haunted Philadelphia seemed to vanish without a trace. Then, 1,700 miles away in Fort Collins, Colorado, reports of eerily similar attacks began to surface. The pattern was unmistakable. Young women living alone, targeted in the dead of night with the attacker scaling balconies or slipping through unlocked windows. Local authorities in Colorado were alarmed by the brazenness of the intruder. In one case, a woman awoke to find a man in her bedroom. In another, the attacker fled mid-assault when startled. The crime shook the quiet college town, and Fort Collins police scrambled to connect the dots. When the details reached Philadelphia, a chilling possibility emerged. The predator who had eluded capture might have relocated and resumed his reign of terror. The turning point came when a meticulous Fort Collins crime lab technician made a critical discovery. While examining a balcony railing at one of the crime scenes, the technician found a set of fingerprints. The prints were entered into national databases, prompting a request for assistance across jurisdictions. The breakthrough came not from Colorado, but from an observant Philadelphia police clerk who matched the prints to evidence from Shannon Schieber's case. The connection was electrifying. DNA samples taken from crime kits in Colorado matched blood evidence left behind in Shannon's Philadelphia apartment. The same predator had struck again, leaving behind a genetic fingerprint that tied him to both cities. For investigators, this was the first solid lead in years, a concrete link between two seemingly separate waves of violence. With this discovery, the hunt intensified. The challenge now was to identify the man behind the DNA and stop him before he could strike again. For the first time, law enforcement had the tools to bring this shadowy predator into the light, but time was running out. With DNA evidence definitively linking the crimes in Philadelphia and Fort Collins, investigators faced a daunting task: identifying a predator who had eluded capture across 2 states. The only clues were fragments of a profile, a physically fit man familiar with both cities, a skilled climber, and someone bold enough to strike repeatedly. To narrow the search, police turned to an unconventional strategy: financial and travel records. A database query focused on individuals who had financial transactions in both Philadelphia and Fort Collins during the timeframes of the crimes. It yielded a list of 319 names, a starting point, but far too broad to investigate thoroughly. Detectives painstakingly sifted through the list, cross-referencing it with known characteristics of the suspect. After weeks of work, they whittled it down to 83 names. These individuals, all potential suspects, became the focus of a coordinated effort between law enforcement agencies in both cities. Each name was scrutinized. Did they have a history of criminal behavior? Did they fit the physical description from the police sketch? Did their movements align with the timeline of the attacks? The process was slow, but with every elimination, the net tightened. The list was sent to Colorado authorities, where detectives conducted background checks, interviewed witnesses, and searched for any connections to the attacks. Then, as if to mock their efforts, the predator struck again. A seventh assault in Fort Collins shook the community and heightened the urgency of the investigation. This time, the attacker left behind not just his DNA, but also a taunting letter addressed to the police. The letter, filled with chilling details of his crimes, revealed his arrogance, but offered no new forensic evidence. It was a psychological blow, but it also reaffirmed law enforcement's determination to catch him. The investigation became a race against time. Every clue, no matter how small, was treated as a potential breakthrough. The cross-jurisdictional collaboration brought together the best minds from both cities, combining cutting-edge forensic tools with old-fashioned detective work. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. After months of relentless investigation, the pieces finally came together. Among the narrowed list of suspects, one name stood out: Troy Graves. His profile sent chills through investigators. Graves, a former Air Force serviceman, had been stationed in Fort Collins during the Colorado assaults and had lived in Philadelphia during the time of Shannon Schieber's murder. He matched the physical description in the police sketch and had a history of voyeurism, spying on women through windows. Detectives began piecing together his movements, finding a disturbing pattern that aligned with the crimes. They unearthed reports from women who had seen him lurking outside their apartments. His fitness and military background explained his ability to climb balconies and evade detection. As the evidence mounted, police obtained a warrant for his DNA. The moment of truth came when the sample was processed. It was an exact match to the DNA left at both the Philadelphia and Colorado crime scenes. The case against Graves was airtight, but investigators weren't taking any chances. They surveilled him to ensure he couldn't flee and gathered additional evidence to solidify their case. When the time came, law enforcement descended on him with precision. Graves was arrested without incident, his double life as a serial predator finally exposed. As the news broke, a sense of relief swept through both Philadelphia and Fort Collins. Women who had lived in fear for years could finally feel safe. Yet the revelations about Graves also brought new horrors to light. He had spent years hiding in plain sight, working as a fitness trainer and blending seamlessly into his communities. Neighbors and acquaintances were shocked to learn the truth, describing him as charming and polite, a stark contrast to the monster revealed by the investigation. For law enforcement, Troy Graves' capture was a bittersweet victory. It marked the end of a long and harrowing chase, but also underscored how dangerously close he had come to slipping through the cracks. The unmasking of Graves was a testament to the power of collaboration, persistence, and forensic science, a triumph born of determination to bring justice to his victims. Troy Graves sat silently in the courtroom as the weight of his crimes came crashing down on him. After months of investigation, forensic evidence, and witness testimony, there was no escape. When confronted with the overwhelming proof of his guilt, DNA evidence, fingerprints, and the accounts of his victims, Graves confessed. He admitted to a chilling pattern of stalking, assaulting, and ultimately murdering Shannon Schieber when she resisted. His confession brought an end to years of terror, but it was only the beginning of justice for his victims. Graves pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including first-degree murder and sexual assault, avoiding a lengthy trial but ensuring he would never harm another person again. At his sentencing, victims and their families filled the courtroom, some for the first time coming face-to-face with the man who had haunted their lives. One by one, survivors stood and recounted their stories, their voices trembling with a mix of anger and resolve. They spoke of the fear that had gripped them for years, the pain of not knowing if he would strike again, and the courage it took to move forward. Shannon's family, devastated by her loss, shared the impact of her stolen future, a life filled with promise, now reduced to memories. As the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, Graves showed little emotion. But for the victims, this moment was a hard-fought victory, a small measure of closure in the face of unimaginable trauma. The sentencing wasn't just about punishing Graves. It was about giving voice to those he had silenced and restoring a sense of safety to the communities he had terrorized. In the aftermath, the case became a symbol of perseverance and the power of modern investigative techniques. It underscored the importance of cross-jurisdictional collaboration and the critical role of forensic science in solving crimes that once seemed impossible to crack. Yet, for all the technological advances, it was the relentless determination of detectives and the bravery of the victims that truly brought Graves to justice. Shannon Schieber's murder left a void that could never be filled. But her case and its resolution highlighted the resilience of those who refused to let her story fade. Her family's advocacy for justice and reform ensured that her legacy would be one of courage, hope, and change.